Okay, so our conference here on theology, disability, and the body of Christ is a joint conference where we're hoping to bring together some of the academic discussions around theology and disability and some of the church-facing discussions around disability in our congregations and in our communities. We'd like to encourage a lot of conversation in this conference, and we've given you plenty of opportunities to talk. So if you're an introvert like me, yes, this is that kind of conference. In our discussions, some very personal things might come up. I imagine some of you have come along to this conference because you're a bit dissatisfied with the way that this conversation has gone on, or with the way that disability has been treated in your communities. Many people are here because we're discussing issues that are deeply personal and very close to them. And we're not always cautious in the way that we use our language. So I'd just like to state that. I'm not setting out any rules of engagement here, but I'd just like to state that for us all to be aware that we are discussing things which are very, very serious and lie close to the hearts of many people. So that even if someone uses a term which you find offensive, we might need to be able to distance ourselves from the immediate emotional response to that to be able to engage well. Tomorrow morning, we'll be having some workshops, and at lunch, from lunch today, we'll have a sign-up sheet for the workshops available in the cafe. There'll be limited places in each, so please pay attention to that. I'll give an introduction to the various workshops later today. Well, for our first session, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Brian Brock, who holds a personal chair in Christian ethics at the University of Aberdeen. Brian is researches in the area of moral and practical theology. He publishes broadly in the areas of theological ethics and in recent years on disability. And he comes to us just having recently published his latest book, Wondrously Wounded: Theology, Disability, and the Body of Christ. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Brian to come and speak to us now.
Hi, and welcome. Thank you for coming. It's a delight. I know many of you I don't know, and I'm looking forward to meeting you in the course of the conference. I very rarely go on the road with Adam, but Stephanie and I have long wanted to meet Francis Young, and if we were both going to be here, the whole family was going to be here. So this is Adam, and this is Stephanie, and this is Caleb, and this is Agnes. They will no doubt provide their own entertainment, light relief along the way. But one of the fun things about disability conferences, unlike most academic conferences, is there's usually a kind of sense of people in the room having something invested in it, and also it not just being about talk. And so having Adam here is a kind of appropriate reminder of what kind of work we're doing. Thank you to Stephen. Let me do a couple of thank yous, who has organized this conference, and I've really enjoyed getting to know he and his wife Heidi, who are kind of keep this place running. Also thanks to Kent Brower and Peter Ray, who floated this idea a long time ago, and it's finally come to fruition, and also to Peter Scott of making the University of Manchester part of this in an official way. So the remit that I have been given for this first session is to introduce more narrowly the book, The Wondrously Wounded, and more broadly the field of disability theology, because my understanding is there are people in the room who aren't really familiar with that as a field, and there are good reasons for that, but it is a kind of academic discipline as well. So I want to do a little bit of work today just to clarify what we mean when we say disability theology. Okay. Really, all of my books are about the same thing. what does it look like to live as Christians in our time and place? I've picked up a few different topics. This one's about disability, but this book is different because it collects 15 years of my reflections on Adam's witness. So I've talked about technology and the use of the Bible and Christian ethics and a few other things, but to talk about disability really became, for me, the story of what I've seen of God in our world through Adam. Disability theology can be characterized as a domain of academic theology that's revisiting all the main topics of Christian theology with that contemporary experience of disability in mind. Now, one of the immediate problems when talking about disability as an academic discourse is that it's just an unbelievably diverse phenomenon. And so here's the definition that I crib from Rosemary Garland Thompson, who's a philosopher, and she gives, I think, a nicely comprehensive definition. So here's the passage from her. Disability is an overarching and in some ways artificial category that encompasses congenital and acquired physical differences, mental illness and retardation, chronic and acute illnesses, fatal and progressive diseases, temporary and permanent injuries, and a wide range of bodily characteristics considered disfiguring, such as scars, birthmarks, unusual proportions, or obesity. Even though the prototypical disabled person posited in cultural representation never leaves a wheelchair, is totally blind, or profoundly deaf, most of the approximately 40 million Americans with disabilities have much more ambiguous relationship to the label. Disability, then, can be painful, comfortable, familiar, alienating, bonding, isolating, disturbing, endearing, challenging, infuriating, or ordinary. Embedded in the complexity of actual human relations, it's always more than the disabled figure can signify. So the sheer breadth of human experiences covered by disability gives you a sense why the field of disability theology demands revisiting all of Christian theology. So the truth is that the reason why I focused on Adam and his witness is that I had to narrow that field down to a set of issues that could be handled in one treatment. And one result of that decision is that the book necessarily focuses on intellectual disability or learning impairment, which in many respects is one of the harder things to talk about academically, because people with intellectual impairment typically can't speak for themselves. So the book is held together as I try to tackle that theme by impressions of what Adam's life has made visible about our world and about the shape of God's loving care for us in it. And so by telling stories, by specifically focusing on precise interactions, I try to show the theological, philosophical, and political implications of his witness in our world. I don't know why he's turning his back to all of you, but perhaps he'll turn around and say something in a bit. One of the big problems about talking about intellectual disability is that disability, especially congenital disability, tends to be imagined as the family's problem. So one of the main reasons that I'm using the language of Adam's witness is to say, if he's witnessing as a Christian. He's not witnessing as a family member. And as a Christian, he is addressing all of us. And so I'm trying to fight the continual habit we have of saying that someone like Adam is really a family's problem or parents' responsibility. The state may come in and help with that, but ultimately it's really a sort of domestic issue. Adam was baptized and confirmed at the Anglican Cathedral where we worship in Aberdeen. And I'm assuming that he's as capable as faith of, as the rest of us, and as much a conduit of the Spirit's gifts to the church as all of us. And over many years of reflecting on his life in those terms, I began to resonate with the patristic theologian Augustine's description of lives like Augustine's as having strange vocations. Like, we don't really understand why their life is put together the way that it is, but he seems to be the way he is to serve a certain role that he plays in the body of Christ in our time and place. So the book is organized around trying to reflect on what exactly, Mom will take your shoes off. One of the main themes of the book is that we tend to reduce the way we think about communication and language and the word down to words, to language, to speech. And you may have picked up that it was very obvious to us that he wanted his shoes off, and he made that clear in an instant. And so there's a lot of communication going on. And one of the large themes of the book is how can we revisit the phrase, and the word was made flesh, recognizing that communication is far deeper than the creedal statement printed in our church leaflet. So now, this is my kind of epicycle on what sort of thing disability theology is. And it's very close to what are typically labeled identity discourses and also contextual theologies. Identity discourses are discourses where people have gathered together under saying, I have a certain identity. I'm LGBTQ, or I'm BME, or I'm Hispanic. One way to think about disability theology is that kind of identity discourse. Another is to think about it as framed by the local questions that a theology is trying to deal with, like Latin American, Argentinian theology under a dictator, right? So those are close to what I'm calling disability theology, but it's easy to confuse disability theology with those two types of theology, which are well known in academic theology. And there is something to the connection, because theologians thinking about disability are indeed revisiting traditional Christian categories in light of the experience of disability. But unlike these contextual theologies and identity theologies, the sheer diversity of the disability phenomenon ends up blowing up any assumed we, right? There's people all around the world having all kinds of different conditions. And if you think you're going to start from a narrow group of people, all of a sudden there's so many people and they're so different that it becomes very difficult to say who's in and who's out. So disability theology does begin with this particular experience. Some theologians work out of their own first-person experience of disability, others reflecting on the experiences of others. But all of those studies are aimed at transformation of social relationships. They seek to challenge the primacy of disabling theological and cultural interpretations and attitudes and assumptions about what it means to be disabled. Now, I have one slide. I hope you can all see it, and I hope it can be pulled up. This is from Nancy Eastland, who was one of the founders of the discipline. And I think she very nicely highlights both the transformative aim and the aim to revisit all of Christian theology. A theology of disability must be a visible, integral, and ordinary part of the Christian life and our theological reflections on that life. As long as disability is addressed in terms of the themes of sin, disability, conflation, virtuous suffering, or charitable action, It will be seen primarily as a fate to be avoided, a tragedy to be explained, or a cause to be championed rather than an ordinary life to be lived. So the Wondrously Wounded is an attempt to take seriously the last line that disability is just an ordinary life, and yet things seem to emerge out of it that in theological, theological in the broadest sense, biblical terms would make us think God's trying to say something to us in the way that we live our lives in the world today through it, right? So that's the witness piece. So the ordinariness and the witness piece seem to suggest that when we're talking about disability, actually we're being pressed to rethink all sorts of things that we take for granted. And just to sort of highlight the terms that Eastland has kind of tried to distance herself from, the sin-disability conflation, right? Many times when people are talking about disability, they won't get much further than, well, we live in a fallen and broken world, and that's why there's disabilities. And that's kind of the end of the discussion, right? That you'll have run into that in churches all the time. So somehow a full Christian theology has to go beyond that. It also has to get beyond the idea that suffering makes us more virtuous, so God sends people suffering. My dear wife gets enraged at the comment that we get now and then, which is, oh, well, you guys, God gave you Adam because he knew you could handle it and that, you needed it. That kind of, I can tell from the crowd that we're not the only ones. Charitable action is perhaps the dominant Western way to think about disability, that from very early in the Christian tradition, the way Christians interpreted the idea of good works as salvific was that we are to look out for those who need to be cared for, and therefore people who had disfiguring conditions or leprosy or were poor, they became the all-time recipients. That's in disability theology called the charity model, that most Christians need to be good to people who need looking after, and it's an act of love or charity to do that. And so Christians should be the one looking out for people that they can be charitable to, and of course people with disabilities get locked always into the recipient end of that category, which is again how the language of witness is an attempt to reverse some of that momentum. And finally, and I think this will probably be a theme that we'll return to, a fate to be avoided or a tragedy to be explained. The sort of the world throws up things that are random or unexplained, and sometimes they fall on you and there's no explanation for that. And Christianity is a set of comforting beliefs that help you make it through the inexplicable evil that befalls you. Okay, that's all I need that slide for. You can leave it up as long as you'd like. So the sheer diversity of the phenomena I've listed as disability inevitably bends all these inquiries into disability back to the question of what it means to be human. What are the limits of the human? And that's why disability theology always explodes the more narrow identity discourse types approaches to theology and the more narrow contextual theology questions, because disability theology always ends up asking, what does it mean to be human? And that includes everyone. Are we really talking about the same problems when we discuss dementia, blindness, autism, chronic pain? How do we square our theological impulses to affirm the self-determination of, we tend to say, I want to valorize people's self-representation, but it will be fairly obvious already to those of you in the room that it's very unlikely for Adam to be able to represent himself in any political sense. So these questions raised by the different phenomena of disability constantly challenge the types of overarching frameworks we use to hold theology together. And that's what's, I think, exciting about disability. So put in more familiar terms, disability theology should not be considered a practical theology, a systematic theology, nor a theological ethics. A diverse set of human phenomena has drawn thinkers from these different fields together and opened a discourse that's not only in dialogue with all these different theological subdisciplines, but also secular disability studies and, at the same time, classic doctrines of creation, scripture, eschatology, and so on. The more important point is that disability theology is inevitably much closer to pastoral theology than most theological disciplines. It can't evade hard questions and difficult lives and uncomfortable situations. And this gives the discourse a tremendous spiritual vitality and a constant feeling that something's as at risk, that you're sort of teetering on the edge of something both important and perhaps threatening. Okay, so that's the introduction to the field of disability. Now let me briefly introduce the argument of the book. The core claim of the book is that Adam's witness displays God's hospitality and welcome in a world that's often not truly welcoming and not truly hospitable. And we in the sort of Western developed world very much like to think of ourselves as at the forefront of welcoming and hospitable culture. So one of the main themes is trying to puncture some of our satisfaction about our moral progress. This is probably the most obvious in the domain of medical ethics. It's well known that in Western societies, most people with Down syndrome are aborted. In many parts of Europe, including the United Kingdom, the termination rate after a prenatal Down syndrome diagnosis is now over 90%. Iceland has basically ended almost Down syndrome from our society, as one geneticist put it. And Denmark is nearing the extinction of Down syndrome, and all pregnant women have been screened since 2004. One of the stories I tell in the book of our adventure is of our adventure in Germany with genetic testing, which is subtly and not so subtly organized around ensuring that people like Adam don't exist. Now you may remember a little closer to home, there was a scandal, one of the usual drumbeat of scandals, back in November or September, about there was an autistic sort of 20-year-old woman taken away from her family, and she sort of ended up in basically a jail cell. I can't remember. Does anybody remember where that was?
I think it was in Northampton. I live near Northampton, and there has been, if it wasn't back in
Yeah.
within the Northampton mental health setting.
All I remember vividly is the picture of I talked to some bishops earlier in the week, and one of the bishops came up to me afterwards and said, the choir takes bets about how long it's going to take for me in a sermon to become emotional. So my family also has the same wager running. Doesn't happen when I'm talking about other topics, I'm afraid. Anyway, there's the terrible picture was this girl sort of not just touching her father's hand through this sort of food flap in an armored door because they didn't have appropriate setup to look after her. So they basically put her in solitary confinement. So those kind of images and scandals remind us of a less well-known fact, which I document in quite a bit of detail since it's relatively less well known, is that those with learning difficulties have measurably worse healthcare outcomes. Our medical systems often find it very difficult to accommodate those who can't fit in, can't turn up on schedule, can't play the game, can't be quiet when they're supposed to. So the first thing that Adam's witness revealed is that even though we in progressive Western societies assume we welcome people like Adam, the facts on the ground look distinctly less hospitable. The truth is probably better summarized as the citizens of Western democratic societies have a soft spot for people with learning difficulties and other disabilities, but this soft spot is rarely deep enough to sustain significant spending on healthcare, treatment, sufficient supported work placements, and other sorts of ameliorative institutional setups. Okay, so that's the first domain where I feel like Adam's witness has been to throw a rather harsh but accurate light on the inhospitality of our supposedly very hospitable society. The second story is from the family domain, and it's more precisely sort of my own inhospitality. I don't let myself off the hook on this front as well, but as an academic, you have to travel, and one of the obvious things that traveling parents do is they bring home something for their, to kind of pay off. Really, it's to sort of mollify the kids, but as you won't be surprised to know that Adam never really was interested in those things. At best, he likes an object like he almost always has with him that has a good throw weight that can be swung. So, when in a pinch, he'll use a sort of plastic fork, right? So it's pretty difficult to feel like, as a father, I've sort of connected and apologized by bringing home something to a kid who's just as happy with a plastic fork and literally wouldn't notice that it was any different than anything he had. Of course, my other delightful kids always like me to bring something home. But what, kind of going through this cycle a few laps, in the end brought home is that Adam, there is no apology for being away. That seems to me both to reveal the kind of manipulative dynamics of the whole operation from my side, which is, what we parents and spouses do. But it also showed tangibly that really the gift is presence. Being together is really more valuable than any other token that I could possibly arrive with. Okay, so now we've got two domains where I feel like Adam's witness has shed a harsh and, in its own way, redemptive light on probably how things could be lived in a more Christ-like way. Now, I'm going to read a passage about the public domain from the book. And this is, I use some militant language, which I'm nervous about and sometimes have been pressed critically about whether it's appropriate to use militant language. We Christians like to be huggable and we like to be welcoming, and so is militant language ever the right language for us to use? Here's a sort of story and an explanation for why I'm using some militant language at the end of the book. Militant language preserves the ethical bite and political force of the gospel. In breaking the stronghold of sin, the Spirit of Jesus Christ reaches into history to create humans whose traits cannot be explained by the normal course of historical cause and effect. Genuinely grateful and welcoming human beings are raised up out of the living death of entrenched habits of ingratitude by the address of Jesus Christ. These are the grounds for hope that Jesus' assault will crack open the shells of self-protection built against those labeled disabled in both the church and the world. Jesus' assault is not against humanity, but in the most fundamental sense creates humanity. Jesus' work is to bring into being human beings who do not stave off and resist the demands of others, but receive them as an offer of new life. Hence the conclusion of Jesus' parable of the vineyard, suggests Maureen Springer, which ends, "The last will be first and the first last." Springer comments, "His kingdom is not an otherworldly domain of future happiness for good people. It's a real boots on the ground, right now kingdom happening around us. What if the least are actually powerful commandos making inroads for the leader in enemy territory? To crack a cold heart, to train it in love, is the most liberating service any person can do for another. These gifts don't show up on an ultrasound. They aren't measured by tests and aren't included in studies on compassionate euthanasia. Astonished by, gathered by, praising, and placing its hope in Jesus Christ, the church is that community gathered by the good neighbor who makes believers into a single communion of good and grateful neighbors. Bringing fullness of life, Jesus Christ, healing peace, quietly but gloriously enters the world, one pool, pub, hospital visit, and street corner at a time. And those are references to stories that I tell in the book. And I might have chosen any number of stories to highlight Adam's role as a servant of the revelatory annunciation of peace. But I want to use one last vignette to underline the fittingness of this annunciation being called an assault of grace. Again, the setting is a public space, this time a crowded sidewalk in the main street in the middle of Aberdeen. Specifically, there's a kind of, it really is the heart of Aberdeen. There's one main busy high street with buses and heavy foot traffic, and there's a graveyard and the main historical church where there often is people lounging about, enjoying what sunshine there might be and whatever soothing substances they can get their hands upon. And right across the street is a McDonald's. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of traffic between those two points. So there's a kind of across the road, people traveling from hanging out in the graveyard, and there's just a churn of kind of teenagers and all the usual stuff that happens on a high street McDonald's. And Adam was actually there with, not with me, but with one of his carers. And an obviously inebriated man is confronting people on the busy sidewalk, shouting into each recoiling face in turn, "Come on, want to fight?" And of course, Adam isn't spared the challenge, offered with the same aggression that's setting the teeth on the edge of everyone within earshot. Without hesitation, Adam reaches up, placing his hand flat across the mouth of the angry man towering over him. This hurting man's aggressive mask immediately crumbled at the personal touch, suffused with kindness. Such events aren't out of the ordinary, and they demand interpretation. Something is being shown here that can be ignored and explained away or received with wonder. Those who dare to respond to this wonder gain a knowledge how that leads into a very different life. So that's three domains where I feel like Adam's witness has challenged business as usual: the medical ethics domain, the family domain, and the public domain. And that brings us to the last domain that I want to talk about before finishing, and that is the church and its inhospitality. If it hasn't happened already, it might happen, and I'm just warning you this, that Adam may say hi to you in the same way he said it to that angry man on the street, and he may, if he's in a cheeky mood, decide he wants to pull your glasses off your face, which is a kind of entertaining experience for parents, because we know that if he does that, and he knows he's not supposed to do that, he's kind of crossing a boundary. And it's a very well-meaning thing for people to say, "Oh no, don't worry about that." But there can be a snowball effect. So I'm just giving you a bit more detail on that because there's a kind of whole cycle of to and fro that goes on around that behavior, which can be very warming to be touched in such an intimate way, but also can be upsetting to people. And the point is that Adam does sometimes invade people's space. And to be at church with him means negotiating these kind of behaviors on a regular basis. And only when I was preparing this talk, I had seen sort of, I don't know, from here to the back, one of our welcome team, a kind of elderly lady, really quite sort of viciously bat him away when he had come into her personal space. And it seemed to me an icon of the type of inhospitality that is very easily ingrained in our church communities. People who don't play by the rules and who make us uncomfortable provoke our natural reflexive defensive maneuvers. And I'm not this particular woman, I'm not sort of singling her out. I'm saying that what she did was what we all naturally would do. And so Adam comes into people's personal space in a way that makes them reflexively defensive, and that's even true in the church. And so for Adam, as I sort of pointed out early on, he's not going to say, take my shoes off. It's all going to be body language, all communication. And that means when you slap him away, that is the only kind of communication he can possibly engage with. And it also reveals very explicitly, if you learn to live in the domain of body language, that very few are prepared to listen to what he might have to say. So that's why the book is really a long discourse on what I think that I've heard him say, because most of us don't really listen to those kind of voices, and we don't take the time to listen to those kind of voices. And I think it's fair to say that that's also true in our churches. So Adam's presence at church does reveal a hard truth, and that is that the church doesn't always welcome difference. Somehow, over the years, Adam's never really been treated as fitting in to the creche or Sunday school. Most congregants, I'm sure just out of very natural discomfort, keep their distance from him in one way or the other. We have a sizable African component in our congregation, and there's a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, who comes every now and again, who has really sort of terrible tumors on her face, and people don't, it's very difficult to sort of face her face to face, and she knows that, and people don't know how to deal with it, and that sort of awkwardness just hangs over her when she's there in a very sort of painful way. Agnes is saying, yeah, she's 11, sorry. So again, these are painful truths, and I've dwelled on them because they make it clear how odd and how supernatural it is that Adam wants to be there. There's a lot of reasons in the language that he lives in that he's being told, we don't really want you here. And yet he clearly does want to be there. And we might have moments along the way when I tell stories about why that's so obvious, but he really does clearly want to be there. And in his desire to gather with the people of God in all their weakness and inhospitality, I can say without any caveat that he's a witness to his parents, who would just as happily not be there now and then, as I know he is to many others. So let me end with one last passage on this topic, and then I'm finished. It's important not to end with a story from the family domain, because the Spirit's gifts are to Adam's family as church. And the Spirit serves the church through Adam entirely independent of his parents' intervention. Adam doesn't sit at the doors of the church as I sort of relate, John Chrysostom, the theologian, talks about poor people sitting outside the doors of the cathedral and says that their rags and their outreached hand are their gift to the church. And he's like, and I'm saying Adam doesn't sit out there outside the doors, preaching with his need and dependence. Ours is a large cathedral church laid out along the traditional Western pattern of the cross. Upon entering the church, one is faced with a long nave filled with wooden pews. Beyond that, a long set of choir stalls, and even beyond that, the communion table. In the middle is the crossing, flanked by the pulpit on one side and a lectern on the other. Much of the liturgical action takes place in the crossing, where our priest, Isaac Pubilon, sings and speaks, stands and kneels for most of the first half of the service. For years, the Brock family has occupied a pew near the front of the congregation, in part so that Adam can hear the action, but originally to be near the only exit, really. In the course of his 13th year, Adam decided that he wanted to sit with Isaac in the crossing. On Pentecost Sunday, he got up and sat on the ground next to Isaac, taking off his shoes and socks and staying within an arm's reach of his presiding minister. And it's a habit that's continued from that day forward. As parents, of course, we had and have to resist the urge to force him back to his seat with the congregation. We've had to negotiate a running inner war with our own expectations about the behavior of children in church, which includes squirming under our inner monologues about the gaze of other congregants and choir members. But encouraged by his minister, and here I use the pronoun intentionally, we've let him continue to pursue expressing his membership in the body in his own way. We would need to think about how or if we should guide him toward occupying this highly visible space in a contributory manner. And we indeed have. And I think what we do with him is we consider his catechesis. Adam's insistence on being right next to the minister has changed the tone of the church in ways we could have never anticipated. A choir used to performing has been forced to ask what it means to have Adam humming between them and the congregation. And I think the most memorable example of that was when he had come in from, we usually walk to church, and we'd come in from a rainy walk, and he had on rain trousers that he wanted to take off, and it was a Christmas service or something, New Year's Eve. And so there was actually a solo with a spotlight, and of course he got his thumb inside all his layers of clothes. Which bothered him not one bit, except for something's wrong here. But everybody else had food for thought. So, cathedral choirs, they're a certain sort of thing. A flagship church has had to ask what it means to have a teenager who walks into the center of church, takes off his shoes and socks, and then sits stimming, rocking back and forth. This sort of repetitious behavior is called stimming. I won't explain it because you can see it. Literally at the feet of the presiding priest. Speaking for myself, one aspect of the Spirit's gift through Adam is to liberate the congregation from any pretension that we are a church devoted to presenting a culturally and aesthetic flawless performance, or that we're not a church for everyone. His lively presence disturbs many common expectations about the behavior of young people in church, as his godfather observed in a letter to him for his confirmation a few weeks from his 15th birthday. You relaxed? Do you want a drink? This is actually the theologian Stanley Hauerwas who wrote this letter, who I asked to be his godfather when he confronted me in public in a setting like this about why I hadn't baptized Adam. So I said, well, okay, then you have to be his godfather. So he wrote this letter upon Adam's confirmation. I only wish I could be there to witness your becoming a stalwart of the church. I put the matter that way because confirmation means the church will depend on you to be fully embodied in Christ. Their matters are tricky because you have for some time represented Christ for the church through your dancing. Some may say that's a strange description of your presence at worship. You just can't be still. But I've always thought when I've been with you in worship, that you're dancing to the music, God's angels as they glorify God. My hunch is you were granted the grace to be closer to those wonderful creatures than those of us who are identified as normal and grown up. So on this wonderful day, dance for the gathered body of believers, because we all need the joy that animates your movements. I'm a little uncomfortable with the kind of holy innocent stuff there, but we can talk about that later perhaps. It's theologically important to admit that the mediator of this liberation in our church is a person who carries the label inferior in his day-to-day life. He embodies a life that most of the congregation, were they honest with themselves, would be ashamed to have to live. But in not being at all ashamed in this way, by being unself-consciously present in joy among those who, whether admitted or not, feel themselves to be capable of doing church properly, the Spirit, through Adam, invites this congregation to engage with a person and hold more loosely to their ideals of performance and aesthetic purity. A church that treats some, like Adam, as continual recipients and never as givers of gifts, enacts a forgetfulness that Christians are Gentiles. Christians have been grafted onto the true vine, and so are the beggars themselves, the unsightly ones being added to Israel. Mediated by Adam's body, the Spirit is inviting the congregation into communion as tangibly as the bread and wine given for us that consummates our communion with the person of Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God, the church never escapes the Spirit, who continually and mercifully reveals that our genetic, physical, mental, national, and religious status is not all there is to us. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Brian. As I threatened before, we've set aside quite a bit of time for a discussion. So we've got some time now for questions. If there's a period of silence, I will get you to discuss things with the people sitting next to you. So it's a bit like the lottery if you don't know the person that you're sitting next to. Now, these sessions are being recorded, and for that purpose, we have microphones set up. If you are able, we'd appreciate it if you could stand and speak into one of the microphones. If you'd like a microphone brought to you, it may or may not be possible, but you could signal to us and we'll see what we can do. In terms of the recording, I don't want anyone to feel like there's something that they'd like to say that they don't want to say because the camera is here. This is not a live streamed session. Anything you say here is not immediately being broadcast to the world, and we have control over what is done with the recording afterwards. So if there's something you'd want to say that you'd rather the world didn't know about, we can edit things out afterwards. So I just wanted to make it clear that you shouldn't let the gaze of the camera dissuade you from speaking up. Anyway, over to you. It's a good idea. If you have a question that you'd like to ask next, you might want to make your way to the microphone in advance. We can even form an orderly queue, as the British are so good at doing.
Okay, that was a long walk. I have so many questions, but I'll just ask one.
Sure.
So I have a daughter with complex needs. She's 16 now. And one of the things you said really hit home about sin disability conflation, because we've always just explained to her in that way. Well, we all have things wrong with us. You know, I have to take tablets. Daddy has to wear glasses. This is what's wrong with your body.
Yeah.
But I'm suddenly like, whoa, how do I put that in words that something beyond that she would understand?
Yeah. I suspect we're going to come around to this topic a couple of laps.
Yeah.
Well, let's just start with one of the problems with that train of argument is that it allows the obviously trite thing to say that, well, Adam's just Adam and you wear glasses, so you both have disabilities, right? That kind of trite angle comes out all too quickly. So I'd say a first thought is we need to somehow our language and descriptions need to recognize that there are gradients of experiences of disability, and that probably the nicest way to put that is that it's not actually costly emotionally or practically to wear glasses, but it is costly emotionally and practically to be autistic, to have to go to an extra class to learn how to speak or to socially interact. And that, I think that kind of emotional tax is really far more important to recognize. And it's obscured when we say, oh, well, I've got a disabled guy on both sides of me, right? Like, I mean, there might be more to the eye than you see with the glasses, but the point is we do have to recognize that some people's whole lives. I had somebody who has a cerebral palsy sort of talk me through what it meant to have spent her 3 years in school just trying to control her tongue. It's just, so I'm trying to avoid superficiality in that description. So that's one piece. Another piece is the world is sort of materially broken, and the Christian confession that the world is fallen is part of that. But you have to be very careful not to, ask the question that the Pharisees asked Jesus: who sinned, this person or their parents? That's the sin disability conflation that Jesus already sort of said, well, that's not really the right question. And Jesus didn't say, let's kind of work out which part's sin, which part's brokenness. He's like, that's just the wrong question. So I think we can ask these questions, but they have to be layered in the right way. And if I was to say, what would I say to a kid? Probably there's people in the room who could answer that question better than I can, because when I'm put in that position, I'm not really asked directly. I can't be asked directly, but I think I would be, theologically put, I would try to redirect that question from the material world to the social world. Yes, it's true. There is diversity of bodies, and that could be because the world is broken, and it might not be. But really what matters is you have to work harder to be part of the life that everybody else shares. And that's sin that makes the world that way.
Thank you.
Just following up on that, Beth Creamer's book talks about limits theology, and she's very clear that she's not talking about limitations. How do you feel that the idea of limits, that we're limited because we are not divine, and we are all limited to varying degrees, addresses the issues you've just been talking about, and the rather trite, well, we're all disabled anyway? Just wondered your thoughts on that.
No, I like that. It's a important book, Debbie Creamer's book, and I think I've already seen Professor Young's response to me, and that's the theme that I think we'll be talking about. But there's one of the spiritual tasks of thinking about disability is trying to figure out how to let the givenness of any given situation be as it is, and not live in a fantasy on top of that world. So for me, practically speaking, the rubber really hit the road for me when I thought, how am I going to imagine Adam in the resurrection? Like, is he going to look like he looks? Is he going to talk like he talks? Is he going to be not able to talk in the way that I think he should? And do I, in effect, already back project my expectations about what counts as his good life by thinking about him in those terms? I think, actually, for me, that's kind of at the core of what it means to be a Christian is receiving the life that you've been given and not living in a fantasy life outside of it, and that is true for all of us in one way or the other. And I think at that level, it's actually not more difficult for people with disabilities in relation to their own condition. It can be more difficult in the sense that if you can't conform to the fantasy of other people, like being an athlete, let's say, right? It'll make it harder for you to be part of society. That's the kind of first response I said. It's part of our sinful world that we live in collective fantasies where cool people can carry a conversation and tell a good joke and be good sportsmen and dance well, let's say, and everybody else is somewhere down below that. So we need to be able to live in the life we have, and that may mean we'll never be able to tell a joke, because it's my own personal Rubicon, and somehow find a way to live naturally in that without being stuck in pining for something else.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. You like that?
Hey. Oh. Do you want to go ahead? That's fine.
Right, I'm going to sign, and the interpreter's going to voice over what I'm saying to you all. It's really interesting because I do feel a connection, and it's linked to communication, the way that you've been speaking about body language in particular. Similar for myself, I express myself through sign language, but I also use my facial expressions and my body language. I'm deaf, and I'm a theologist myself. One thing that's really, really interesting to me, and has really started making me think and to have a discussion, is that word of Jesus. Flesh, Jesus as flesh. You know, we think so much about everything communicating through our ears. Yeah? That word of flesh, that word of body of Christ. And it's not a question, it's just this topic that you've brought up. Adam, his way of communicating and just showing to the world his witness.
Yeah, thank you for, I guess I'll wait till you come back so we can get it going both directions. Thank you for making that observation. I have a doctoral student who's a deaf minister, and she's really been educating me on a lot of these aspects of what it means to be church and be deaf and be translating, and I've learned enough that I know that she would be uncomfortable that the translator is over there, so that the person being translated for has to look at the translator and not at the person speaking, right? These are, the visual field becomes like, for hearing people, the audio field, right? If you're outside and you can't hear, then you're cut off. But for a deaf person, sight lines are their audio field. I mean, obviously, that's all fascinating stuff. In the book, I try to build some reflections on this point around the obvious fact that I've never heard mentioned in any other context, that we can assume that the wounded man lying in the ditch that Jesus came on in the story of the Good Samaritan was not speaking, or it would be a plausible reading of the text. And so it seems that there's 4 people interacting with this person non-verbally, and pretty clear what's needed by the way that his bodily comportment is presenting itself. There's a cry for help that Jesus says the Samaritan heard. And that seems to me a very basic observation about how human interaction happens that, again, Adam's witness has taught me to take much more seriously than I would have otherwise. And I think, just to add one more bit to that, it's an example of how there is a growing groundswell of biblical interpreters who say, I'm interpreting from my disabled experience. And very often those readings do produce super interesting insights into what's there in the text. I mean, it is we have no indication that the wounded man in the ditch said anything. And we've never taken that seriously, except for this disability context sort of forces it to the surface.
The paralytic doesn't say anything either. He just gets lowered down. I'm interested, and this is sort of a curiosity, wondering, thinking out loud. Sorry, Brian, you know me. About the connection between original sin and brokenness, because I think that there is one. But I think that the sin-disability connection misconstrues it. I mean, what if it's not to do with punishment, but it's to do with the way in which we need signs for the condition of our own brokenness in the world? I really liked what you said about the commandos kind of leading the way. But it reminded me of Jesus talking about the children being the ones who are guaranteed. You know, they're the ones who can lead you into the kingdom of God. You have to be like this. That we need children to lead us into the kingdom of God because of that original sin and the brokenness and the messed upness of the world that creation is groaning. And I wonder if it wouldn't be too far to suggest that actually there's a sense in which people with intellectual disabilities in particular share in that kind of sign or leadership towards the kingdom of heaven, that because of the brokenness of the whole world, not because of any particular person's brokenness or particular sin, but just because creation is skewed. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
I'm pretty committed to the, it's really a theological axiom, premise, that everyone that's born of Adam and Eve is capable of sin and sanctification. So that's hence the comment about the sort of holy innocence, my discomfort with the holy innocence, right? So there was there has been put in various ways through the Christian tradition that some people don't need to take the sacraments because they haven't reached the level of understanding to sin. That's the holy innocent tradition that I'm pressing about. So it's very easy to read that line of argument along that holy innocence, right? So the birds and the lilies of the field, they haven't sinned, and that's why Jesus refers to them. And there are some people walking around who have never been tainted by original sin. And I can't really find a way to work with that tradition. Which leads me to say, yes, I think someone like Adam, for instance, can willfully resist and sort of be aggressive towards people, right? That would be one way to talk about how he could participate in sin and redemption and sanctification. At the same time that it seems to me just a truism that it's a shame that Hitler wasn't born a Down syndrome person. Right? Like in a sense that it's very clear that really destructive, far-reaching sin takes a certain amount of intelligence. So maybe it's the reverse of the discussion we started out with about how a young person asking how to understand sin and disability. One piece of the puzzle is to say, we live in a sinful world that can't actually take diversity seriously and reacts badly to it. Maybe the other side of that is to say that it takes a wicked amount of intelligence to come up with a plan to kind of exterminate people, right? Since we're in the Auschwitz week, so anniversary week, right? So that I think the amplitude of sin and its destructiveness can vary according to how much capacity people have, but I don't want to let anybody off the hook as a sinner
Can I just follow up by saying, no, I wouldn't let anyone off the hook. I'm an Augustinian when it comes to children and sin. So they begin that way. I mean, my question is much more along the lines of, is there not something about being the least and experiencing the world differently that enables people or helps makes people who experience the world and see the world differently signs for us and signposts for us towards the kingdom of heaven? That was basically the question.
Yeah, it's simply the fact that that's how it works out, both in the biblical story and in life. So we're just looking for descriptions for that. It has rarely been taken as a task of the theologian to describe that nexus, but you and I are both attempting to do that, and hopefully more of you will be tempted as well.
Starting from a confessional point of view, as a heretical Pelagian, I don't accept the Augustinian analysis of people being born sinful. But what interested me was your last comment, or your reference to the biblical text of the Samaritan. But some of the biblical texts that grip my attention and seem so authentic are the exasperation, anxiety, and desperation of parents whose kids are throwing themselves in the fire, cutting themselves in the graveyard, and the way the text represents possession and external evil. The intelligence, I think, is referred to commit evil, but that actively destructive, anti-human stuff. But then the texts make very personal, as in a real devil, a real possession, real external hostility in those situations. From a theological point of view, how do you treat those texts in the context of all that you're doing there, and that not just the social side, which you've expressed really clearly, and the church side, but that other dimension?
I'm certainly open to taking that as those as literal descriptions. And I would say that it is unfortunate that the only ways that those get taken as literal description is when people try to exercise, for instance, autistic children. I think, working in a university where there's an epidemic of self-harm, I think there's other places to put that reality. And I don't think all sorts of conditions are really appropriately labeled as demonic work. But I do think that there are realities that are appropriately labeled as demonic work.
Well, the length of time I've been in the queue, I think you've kind of got into it already. I don't really understand what systematic theology and all these things are, but I concur with the description of disability theology fitting well as a pastoral theology. But I also feel really strongly that it has to inform biblical studies, as you've already brought out, and as the lady theologian over there has already brought out, about who gets to interpret the Bible, and how do we both amplify and increase the access to the authority of hermeneutics to people who don't see, hear, experience, bodily inhabit the world in these sort of norms. And then how does someone like you, who is interpreting for someone else, how do we cross-check our credibility of that in terms of interpretation of the Bible?
Some of my earliest work was on these kind of questions, and I would say, and what I argue there is that the text is infinitely deep and rich, and so the obvious way to think about what's going on in terms of these disability readings is all the interpreters who have been authoritative and gotten to speak in public, at least let's say over the last 50 years, just didn't care about disability. So they just didn't see that horizon of the text, but that horizon of the text is quite obviously there. So that's one of the ways to go back to sort of Maddie's point, that just caring about the phenomenon helps you to read the Bible better. And I think that would be my global picture of how hermeneutics should work, that if you are paying attention to the world and you presume that Scripture addresses everything, you will see things that you didn't see otherwise.
Mine's connected to biblical kind of thing. You're interested in your thoughts. I recently finished a master's in disability studies, so coming much more from kind of that perspective. But I explored the representation of disabled women in Luke's Gospel from a feminist disability studies perspective. And just the reason I kind of say that is one of the things that I found is that at the beginning of Luke, I could identify perhaps 7 disabled women, and by the end of Luke, there were none. And I know from more of a disability studies perspective, sorry about my son, that can feel kind of eugenic, almost. You know, we're talking about kind of Nazis and things. And yeah, thinking about the woman in your church who kind of very much was rejecting this idea that actually most of the disabled people that Jesus approached within the New Testament aren't disabled by the end of the New Testament. And today, obviously, there's healthcare, there's impairment and disability is very complex, but we don't see healings in the same way. And lots of people don't want to be healed as well. And within cultural disability studies, there's very much the thought that these representations structure reality within the socio kind of cultural imagination, within literature, within kind of everything. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a very important sort of cross-fertilization that theologians haven't typically taken seriously enough. I've just been reading through some of the Genesis stories, and I mean, it just has to be said that there's some pretty disturbing stuff going on from a feminist point of view. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not our authoritative text, but to say, well, we couldn't have a kid, so, here's my concubine. Well, there's ways in which the stories that are contained in our Bible do press us to ask questions about the extent of their applicability in our world. And the discourse you're coming out of is asking those questions, typically from a kind of hostile perspective. The Bible is just one more of those texts that erases disability and subjugates women. And I don't think we're going to get anywhere in answering those kind of questions by admitting, well, yeah, that has certainly happened, and yes, there are those strands in the text. And I think in the discourse you've come out of, that would be about as far as things tend to go. So I'm trying to open up a sort of cross-fertilization with Christians to begin to help them admit, yeah, that actually has gone on. We have been the sort of community that would force, for instance, women into certain culturally normative roles. But more to the point to our discussion today, we have also been the kind of place where people would walk up and say, you need to be healed from this, and we'll heal you right now. And that happens. I mean, people come up to me all the time, being in the business, and saying, this happened to me. So if we don't think that disability is something that the reign of Christ erases from the world now, we actually need to do a little more work to describe why that's not the case. And that will then point us back to specific biblical passages to reflect further on. I think we'll no doubt come back to this theme, but the exact reference is escaping me at the moment, but one of Jesus' interactions, the guy's sort of yelling, Lord Jesus Christ, right? He's making a sort of claim of attention by using the entirely appropriate description of Christ, and he's disabled and he can't get over to Jesus. And Jesus doesn't just heal him, he says, "What do you want?" Right? So there, again, that kind of disability experience and knowing that there are people who are going to come into churches and be perceived as, "Oh, well, you just haven't had enough prayer over you." That helps us to read the Bible better.
Got 2 more questions.
Okay. I've got a daughter, Claire, who is now 31 with Down syndrome. And she's an incredibly articulate, challenging, and very vibrant young lady who is trying to forge her life with the constraints of social services and society. But I want to go back to when she was first born and her baptism, because she was only six weeks old when she was baptized, and it was an incredibly moving and emotional service. And it was very much that I felt incredibly strongly she was known and loved by God just as she was, and created in the image of God. Now that has set me off on a journey of what does it mean to be created in the image of God? And then what does that start to help me on a journey? What does that say about God? That she's no less than her older sister without Down syndrome, who is also created in the image of God. And the whole journey of looking at God as weak and vulnerable and disabled that Claire takes me on. But for, what does it mean to be in the image of God, and what does that say about God?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And the one quote that I gave from Nancy Eastland's book, The Disabled God, she's has a sort of degenerative bone, or had a degenerative bone disease that meant basically her bones were crumbling. And she sort of had a vision in an almost mystic sense of God in the kind of wheelchair that she uses, which is, she directs by breathing into a little pipe. I think that is part of the way Christian theology has to proceed to respond to the last type of question that I asked, that there is our tradition capacious enough to talk about the weakness of God, and in what way do we do that appropriately? I'm sure that we will return to this theme, but it's great to hear that the tradition gave you the tools to start down that journey 30-something years ago, when it really wasn't something that was talked about in a very sort of coherent way at that time.
We have 2 more questions, and I think that's all we'll have time for in this session.
Well, I'm happy to stand, but it will limit the length of my question, which is probably a good thing. I do struggle to get around, but I also suffer from constant permanent pain. And it's really a story from the lady who just spoke here before. There she is, Dana. And it's that link to, yes, it's the biblical text, but also it's the experience of the church. I was on a pain management course, 6-week course, with people who had different long-term health conditions. And as part of that, I shared a little bit about how do you live with your worst day? And as part of that, I had 5 things on a cube which helped me through. And somebody pointed out the 6th side of the cube and what was on it. And I said, well, actually, I'm a Christian. It's God, Trinity. There's something of God in how I live through the bad day. To which every single person in the room said, since I've been diagnosed, I've been to church, but I no longer go. And the only person who still went was me, who's paid by the Church of England. So actually that, cutting out the story, the biblical thing, also, I don't know their stories, but it has that impact, and it's important to put in, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I hope that I'll talk in the next session about feeling compelled to talk about these issues because of what I feel has been announced to me through Adam's life. And I hope that having been compelled into that position, it will catalyze a reversal of that, I think, status quo. I think it's safe to say that there are far too many stories of people saying, just sort of smirking when they're Christians, but they don't go to church for whatever reason associated with the awkwardness of having a child who's going to do this sort of thing, right? And what kind of feedback they get from that, or all the things that come with their particular condition. I hope that where this is all going is to somehow dissolve and break down and humiliate that prideful status quo.
You've been very patient.
Thank you. So I have my eldest son is autistic, and he's very high functioning. But the exchange that I've had with lots of people about him always goes down the same kind of avenue, which is it sits within like a contractarian sort of theory that, there are ways to be in this world, and there are ways of contributing to this world, and some of them are to be overcome by difficulty. And so having a child with autism means that you're either pitied or the child is a hero. So you're in that. And so it seems that lots of people want to overcome the problem by referring to the disabled body as the hero body. Yeah. There's someone to be lauded, and aren't they amazing for the overcoming sort of story that goes along with that. And I just wonder, you sort of slightly touched on it, but whether you would say something a little bit more about the challenge of what it feels like to engage the need for someone else to make someone a hero, to overcome the gap of awkwardness.
Yeah. I mean, as a theologian, I can't escape from my own internal monologue runs. That's like a really superficial way to put it. So my first layer is, don't say that. And then I try to think, okay, what are there's outer poles around these discussions, which, as you very rightly point out, that's where the whole discussion always lives. This is interpersonally and rhetorically the most important and the most difficult work, because there's no answer to where you go at that point. I would say that my book is just one long exercise in saying these are the superficial poles we mostly live in, and here's a way to think about what's going on in the middle. And as I often say, personally, how I encapsulate my response to that is it is my worst nightmare that people will experience Adam as, oh, we've got a disabled person here, or we've got a wholly innocent person here, or what, he'll be just encapsulated, enwrapped, sort of blocked out by those platitudes, which means he'll never be taken seriously for who he is, which obviously some days has its downsides, some days has its upsides, some moments has its downsides and upsides. And I think I want to pulverize the hierarchy of attention, which says people like the two of us, you should pay real close attention to and listen to. People like him and your son, you just got to manage this situation with them. And I think the church can do better on that.
Well, thank you. It's been a very enlivening first session. Please join me in thanking Brian again for his